Yeah, perfect. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. I'll be talking about reducing the carbon footprint of imaging research computing. So I guess focusing on the environmental impact of imaging research. For some context, I've been doing this work for the last couple of years. Again, focusing specifically on functional MRI neuroimaging. But the lessons I'll talk about here should really apply to any field using large data sets or heavy compute. So we don't often think about the carbon footprint of computing, but obviously there is one. Every time that we store data, when we process data, we're using energy, and therefore we have a carbon footprint. And it's estimated that data centers in the IT sector accounts for somewhere between 1 and 4% of global CO2 emissions, which is a lot when we consider that aviation and shipping both contribute about 2% each themselves. Things like advances in hardware mean we're becoming more efficient at running software, which is great. But as I'll come back to later, we're worried about this idea of a rebound effect, where resources becoming cheaper and more available mean we end up using more of them rather than just using less or using them more efficiently. So thinking first about the footprint of data storage, as a basic rule, the more data that we store on servers, the more energy we need to operate, and importantly, to air condition them for the overheads these data centers need. And although it's going to vary a lot based on hardware, this is somewhere on the magnitude of 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide per terabyte per year that we're storing. This also means we have more data to back up, which requires computations. And maybe most importantly, the faster that we fill servers up with data, the more quickly we need to manufacture and transport new servers in to supplement or replace them. And the embodied footprint from this hardware is often going to be far larger than the energy needed to store data alone. I think this becomes a particular issue under two circumstances. So with this idea of dark data, if we think about a PhD or a postdoc in a lab who generates a large data set but doesn't provide any documentation as to what it is or how to interact with it, if they then leave, they're in a situation where their boss might be unable to make any use of it because they don't know what it is, but they're also uncomfortable deleting it because it might be useful down the line. So that data will just sit there forever being functionally invisible and taking up space. Then there's junk data. So even when we do know what data we want to keep, it might be that we have large chunks of that data that is intermediary or just serves no practical use to us in our own research. And again, just sits here taking up space. So there might be some low-hanging fruit that we can avoid here. Just an example, I'll talk a few times today about fMRI Prep, which is some software we work with for our data. Um, we found that across a sample of 257 participants, 96% of the files that was generated automatically by this pipeline had no practical research use to us at all, and we could safely delete these files. So we developed an automated script to run through, identify and delete these files, and managed to save ourselves over a terabyte of storage on this sample. So again, often low-hanging fruit of, we may generate a lot of data that we don't need to keep, so it's worth thinking carefully about this. And a good way to avoid dark data in general is just having a strong data management plan. So understanding where data will be stored, whether that's on our own servers or remotely somewhere. How much will we store? If we have an idea ahead of time of how large a given data set is going to be, this helps us to understand our impact more easily. What can we safely delete? Again, looking for that low-hanging fruit. And finally, thinking about when we can ultimately archive or delete data. We'll often say in data management plans that we'll aim to delete data after 10 years or just when it stops being useful. But in reality, it's not clear how often this happens. So having a good plan just keeps us accountable in this way. So I'm now going to talk about the carbon footprint of data processing, so pre-processing and analysis of data. And luckily for us, we can estimate the carbon footprint of our computing using this broad formula of the energy needed for CPU and RAM for a given job, multiplied by the power use effectiveness, which is basically the efficiency of our hardware. And again, those overheads like air conditioning and lighting and how much energy do we need for that. And finally, the carbon intensity of our energy supply. And this basically reflects for each kilowatt hour of energy that we use, how many grams of carbon dioxide are we emitting? And this is obviously lower when we can rely on more renewable low carbon energy sources. Luckily for us in the UK, we have access to live data, so at any given time we can see what the carbon intensity of the country or of specific regions is. And this is some data from that live API. The important thing to note here is that we see these really systematic patterns of carbon intensity where it tends to be at its highest at the start and the end of the working day when we're forced to rely on when energy usage is higher and we have to rely on more high carbon energy sources. And it's lowest overnight and over the weekend when overall usage is lower and we can fall back on those renewable sources. So this means if we can schedule computing to run at times of low intensity, we can use the same amount of energy while using sometimes substantially less carbon. And there are automated tools out there which allow you to do this. So once we put all this information together, again, we can estimate our footprint. I'm just going to highlight a few tools that can do this already. So on the left, we have the Green Algorithms Calculator. This is just an online calculator, so it's a website where you can go and manually input parameters like how long your job's going to take to run, whether you're using CPUs or GPUs, and the type of processor you're using, and it'll give you an estimate of your footprint. So this is accessible to everyone, but requires kind of manual input. Then on the right, Green Algorithms for HPC, provided by the same team, which basically makes use of logs generated by high-performance computing clusters, so information that will already be regularly available. And this provides a dashboard that estimates one's footprint and translates that into things like percentage of a flight from Paris to London. So this is all open source and available as well, and it's a really good solution for carbon tracking. So I'll very briefly talk about some empirical work we've done, again, looking at neuroimaging data, fMRI. We wanted to measure the carbon footprint of this tool, fMRI Prep, that I mentioned. This provides us the option to add, remove, or vary different data processing options, which is great because it means that we could look at the carbon footprint of specific steps here. And without going into this in too much detail, so we ran the same data through 8 different versions of the pipeline with different settings added or removed. And we have in green here our estimated carbon emissions, and in pink and purple we have the performance of our pipeline, so our measure of kind of data quality that we used. And the important thing to note is that these things dissociate. So we can see that when we removed the step of free surface reconstruction, which is there by default, but we don't need it, emissions decreased by 48%, but with no drop in data quality. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, when we increase the resolution of our data from 2 millimeters to 1 millimeter, emissions decreased by 70% and file size by 200%, but with no benefit in performance. So there's often fairly easy, again, low-hanging fruit, ways that we can reduce our footprint without sacrificing the quality of our data, which is what to look for. So I'll now talk a bit more generally about the future of computing and how things might change in the coming years. And the first will come as a surprise to no one, the adoption of machine learning and artificial intelligence. We're using this more in our everyday life, but also we're starting to see it in our research more, particularly in neuroimaging. We've already seen that data centers in the US, specifically for AI, are outcompeting energy usage from local communities using the energy of a small city. And in the UK, we're seeing data centers that are outcompeting water usage for residential homes that's needed for cooling in these data centers. So as this becomes more widespread, our footprint's likely to continue growing. As I said before, we have an upgrades in hardware efficiency, which is great, which means we are able to do the same computing for less energy, and hopefully we see that continue over the coming years. There's the idea of increased centralization. Basically, larger data centers tend to have better power use effectiveness, so that they're more efficient in terms of the overheads they'll use, like for air conditioning. So the more we use these centralized solutions, the more efficient our computing might become, although often this means relying on large tech companies at the moment. And finally, decarbonization of energy. So again, as we adopt more and more low carbon energy sources, we can use the same amount of energy for less carbon, which is great. And we've been seeing this carbon intensity drop in the UK year on year. Obviously, though, this is limited by the physical infrastructure that we have for renewable energy. So if our energy usage continues to grow exponentially, it's not a sustainable solution. Again, this idea of the rebound effect. So if you imagine energy that we need for running a car becoming more efficient, it might be that we'd expect direct decreases in energy usage, but maybe because we have lower petrol bills, we end up taking more holidays in Spain, meaning that we end up using more energy on balance, kind of via an indirect route. And this is basically what we're worried about with computing, where the availability of these more high-tech and new resources mean we end up finding new ways to use them and therefore having a larger footprint rather than just making our existing computing more efficient. So who's responsible for all this? I think researchers and scientists have a really important role to play. We have the most direct insight into our own work, and therefore we're best placed to measure our carbon footprint. Suppliers and tool developers have a role here in providing and developing hardware and software that's more sustainable, environmentally sustainable, and therefore making this accessible to researchers. Institutions like universities, like the one I'm in, can hire dedicated technical staff to focus specifically on sustainability within their workload. This basically helps to make sure it remains a priority and again avoids putting too much burden on individual users. And funders as well have a really important role to play in setting guidelines and requirements for researchers and scientists to at least think about the environmental impact of their research, including computing, but also various other things that might be relevant. Before finishing, I'll just highlight this green disc, which is a recent certification scheme which allows you to gain kind of bronze, silver, or gold certification for the sustainability of your research computing. It provides a number of actionable things that you can do to help track your progress. So this is really worth getting involved with, either at the level of institution or the level of a specific research group. But yeah, I'll just end there by saying thank you, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thanks.